Welcome to the Genesis story. We've now got to part 4, and I've entitled this Human Rebellion. And we're looking now at Genesis chapter 3. Before we start, let's look back and just remind ourselves of the key events of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. In Genesis chapter 1, we've seen God creating the whole universe, and a sequence of ordering and filling this planet with life. Life that has its own reproductive power, not dependent on some kind of supposed fertility gods. Mankind being created in the image and likeness of God, to do the things that God does, and to be the kind of people that reflect God's nature. The fruitfulness of the land to get our food doesn't depend on deities. It's built in. A sea which is not a source of evil, but just part of God's creation. And sun, moon and stars that are simply created objects. They have no control over human destiny at all, and they are not to be worshipped. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2. A picture of God's ideal, pictured beautifully in the context of a story, built around a couple in a garden paradise, where the dual nature of humanity is stressed, physical and spiritual. Humans have responsibilities, but there are boundary conditions, because that gives security. God provides everything, but we have to use what's there. That's our responsibility, to look after his world. And the goal? Immortality. Resurrected life beyond death. The complementary nature of man and wife in a total commitment of marriage, glued together. That's God's ideal, pictured in chapter 2. In chapters 2 and 3, the writer has mainly used that description to describe God, Yahweh Elohim, combining the two words translated in English as Lord God. Elohim stresses the sovereign creator nature of God, where Yahweh stresses the idea of relationship. That phrase is only used in Genesis 2 and 3. It doesn't mean that there's been a second author and it's been edited together necessarily, because that's the right description for the theme of these 2 chapters. I come back to this because we're going to see there are some exceptions. Now there's a problem with humanity, a strange contradiction. We are capable of the most amazing achievements. The things we've developed as human beings, the things we've made, are unbelievable. If our ancestors could see the world as it is today, they would scarce believe it. Creativity. And so much has come from our achievements. And they have transformed human lives for the good. All the inventions, all the developments, all the changes, all the technologies, all the science-based activities, all the communications, transformed and changed. But as a race, we're not very nice. Historically, we have perpetrated some of the most terrible evils. Indeed, they're still going on, exactly the same today. And people are suffering in the most horrendous way. What the writer here is trying to give us is an explanation. Why is it so? Human beings created in this most marvelous way. A world that is fit for purpose and very good. And yet that's reality. Why? The fundamental basis of human rebellion is that we think we're cleverer than God. And we can decide. And we know more than God knows. That's just an element of pride. And that leads to rebellion. Now you hear it and see it all the time in conversations with friends. You may even be part of it. We all are. We think we know better than God. We can decide. And then we do it our way. And the writer here is revealing this as a really memorable story, so it sticks in our mind. It carries its impact. Because that's the way communication was done when this was written, in a day when people couldn't read and write. I want to look at chapters 2 and 3 just for the moment here. Look at the pink column. That's what God said. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden. Chapter 3, the column to the left, what the woman said, we may eat from the trees in the garden. The writer uses language very precisely, and the word any is omitted. It's the beginning of a slippery slope when we fail to recognize the scale of God's provision. Look again. Look at the pink column. God said you mustn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. When the woman quotes it, but God did say, you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. Quite a few changes there. Let me just pick up one in the blue column. Touching the tree has been added. Oh, how often we do this. We present God as a kind of restrictive spoiler. He's a kind of heavenly policeman, out to make our lives miserable by a set of rules. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. Don't eat this, don't drink that, don't go there. Wear this, don't wear that. That's not the God of the Bible. And a God who's like that isn't worth worshipping. But that's a human trait. God doesn't work by that kind of rule book mentality, as the New Testament makes so clear. Now look at the two columns brought together as the bright yellow one. This is going back to what it's talking about Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. But it drops down to Elohim when the snake uses it, and it's picked up by the woman. And look at the right-hand column. You see we've reduced our concept of God. You see it's a kind of slippery slope. We fail to recognize all the good things that God's provided. We start to see God as a kind of restrictive spoiler, and we've reduced our concept of God. If you ask people throughout our society today, most people will say that they believe in a God who made everything. They've got Elohim. But very few have got Yahweh, a God who's personally involved with humanity, wants a relationship with us. We've reduced our concept of God. It's just, again, the subtle use of language. A small point, but it illustrates the slippery slope of how things actually work. He was subtle. He didn't tell the woman to eat the fruit. He just simply questions whether death was inevitable. And in one sense, he was right. The man and the woman didn't drop dead, so it cannot possibly be referring to physical death. But the consequences were just as God warned. The security had gone. Before each other and before God. And they were blocked off from the tree of life. Immortality in a resurrected body. That door was shut and totally shut. That's death. Spiritual death. They wanted to hide from each other. Oh, we do this when we've done something wrong. We can't face each other. We can't face God. We pretend he's not there. And the security is gone. You see, the snake didn't challenge the command of God head on. He was too clever for that. He challenged the consequences. We do exactly the same. And our great inheritance that God planned for us was lost. and it can only be restored by God's grace. But that's another story. This is a problem we all have, because when we deny the consequences of an action, it allows us the freedom to do anything we like. We uncouple consequences to what we're doing. And it gives us this kind of pseudo-freedom of action, but actually it's just slavery. Isn't this an accurate picture of humanity? Isn't this an accurate picture of what the world is really like? The snake was devious. And we tend to have a kind of ambivalent attitude towards snakes. Sometimes we see them as threats, sometimes as dangers, and they can be dangerous. Sometimes we're fearful of them. Sometimes we associate them with evil. That's not the way Genesis pictures it. The snake was created by God, the Lord God. There's no hint in this chapter that the author saw the snake as Satan. That comes later. Later Jewish writings, they identified the snake with Satan, the adversary of mankind. But in Christian writings, we've got to wait to the book of Revelation before it's explicit. Look at that verse. That ancient serpent, snake, called the devil or serpent who leads the whole world astray. Another verse in Revelation, he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent, snake, who is the devil or Satan. The identification is now complete. But it's a story with meaning. And it forces back that human beings, the man and the woman, us, you and me, we take responsibility for our actions. We don't pass the buck. This chapter was written to show the origin of all that is wrong in the world of the time. And remember, there were many other accounts on the go that come up with very different conclusions. Human rebellion against God is where the fundamental problem rests. And it's a human response. We carry responsibility for wanting to do it our way in independence. It's a story full of action. The excitement of it, it holds us. She saw, she took, she ate, she gave, he ate. Their eyes were opened. They realized they were naked. They sewed. They made coverings. They heard. They hid. You see, we remember it. Actions uncoupling the consequences. But the consequences followed just as God had predicted. Their security with each other was compromised. Their security with God was shot to ribbons. They tried to cover themselves from each other. They tried to hide from God. Oh, how sad. One of the greatest problems we human beings have is lack of security. But one of the greatest things that all human beings long to possess, all of us, security. And we'll do anything and go anywhere to try and find it. Because that's what we were built for. And we lost it. But we also lost our destiny. The plan of God that we should move from this life through death into a greater life in a resurrected body, denied to us. The destiny was gone. The paradise doors were shut and locked, and we were locked outside. And only by God's intervention and grace can that be reversed. We're not capable of reversing it. We can't get back into that garden paradise. All told in the form of this beautiful story. We looked at death before. God said they would surely die, but they didn't drop dead. And we know from the evidence from outside that human beings have always been dying, and so have all the animals and plants. This didn't introduce death in a physical sense into the world. The physical sense where our souls, the bit that makes you and me what we are, our personality, nature, our wills, losing the body. This was more a spiritual death. We lost our security, we lost our relationship with our Creator. And it led to an eternal death. Once we went through physical death, we lost everything, because immortality was closed off to us. And only God can reverse that. We can't. And by God's grace, through what Jesus has done, that door has been reopened for those who wish to enter. But as I said before, that's another story. The story is telling us, with the New Testament interpretation, that there's a powerful and personal force of evil in the world, represented in the story by a snake that speaks, explained in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Revelation. Starts when we doubt the nature and generosity of God. We write God down because we're trying to write ourselves up. And we think our minds and our brains are clever enough. We can outgo God. It doesn't work. It's a delusion. Doing it my way. And we take to ourselves that we are the lawmakers. We can decide independently of God, and we lose the whole purpose and nature. He wants to give us freedom within the security of the paradise that He's made. But the boundary conditions are, to get that security is to go His way. And we start to use our minds to interpret, to reinterpret, to deconstruct, to work things out for ourselves, and to insist that we've autonomy. We have the right to decide for ourselves. So when something attractive seems there, it overwhelms the direction of God. We've done it our way. And there are consequences. Security goes. The thing that humans need more than anything else. Watch the young child. Even watch the rebellious teenager. Watch the couple new into marriage, desperate for the security of each other. Watch it in the workplace. Watch it with grandparents, the security of their future. Relationships fall apart. The marriage one is pictured here, but all relationships become damaged. We start to compete, jockeying for power, and eventually it leads to abuse of power, maybe even violence. And we've lost our destiny. What God intended for us, the very purpose of life, immortality, and a resurrected body, the model is that of Jesus. We've forfeited it by going our way, thinking that we're more clever than God. And it all goes back to that root problem. We put ourselves in the central position. We rationalise and we decide. And God is pushed out. How accurate this picture is to life. In the New Testament, two alternatives are painted. Using the words of Paul, conformed to the pattern of this world. We do it the normal way society expects, the way our culture demands, the way we decide. And God's pushed out. Oh, it's sad to see the majority of lives in Western Europe where God has almost no place at all. He doesn't want to come in as a spoil sport or as a supernatural policeman. He just wants us to be liberated, and he can do it to full living. And we think we can do it better on our own, running our own lives. God is pushed out. And our ideas, our values, our aspirations, our thoughts, our brains, we decide. Conformed to the pattern of the world and lost in insecurity. And Paul paints the other picture, transformed by the renewing of the mind. See, it all starts in the mind. It all starts in how we think. It all starts with our beliefs. We put God back by our choice. We accept that he's the creator. He knows what he's doing. He made us. He knows what is best for us. He has nothing but good for us. And we choose to go that way. And we're set free. Free in security. He provides all the resources. He gives us the direction. He makes life rich and full. And we pass from this life. Death has no fear for us, because we pass through this life into a resurrected life beyond. That's the picture the New Testament has painted. Genesis presents an understanding of the tragedy, the bitter tragedy of what we've done. There is a view that it doesn't matter what you believe. It's what you do that matters. Now, in a sense, there's a bit of truth in that, because how we behave is what really matters, how we treat each other. But what you believe strongly influences how you behave. Let me give you 3 illustrations of this. That's what Hitler said. I want young men capable of violence, imperious, relentless, and cruel. He got them. That was his belief. He saw violence and power struggles as the way to success. And think of the lives, the families, the communities, the nations that suffered because of that one man's beliefs. It affected his behaviour and rubbed off on his followers. Think of that. Taken from the Quran. Believers, retaliation is decreed for you in bloodshed. In retaliation, you have a safeguard for your lives. Set in context. What the Prophet is saying there is, if someone has wronged you, you have the right to retaliate. In fact, and more than that, you should retaliate, otherwise they'll do it again. That is a belief. And it underpins and explains and interprets so much of the brutality that we see in the Middle East at the moment. Because these men, and it's mainly men, are justifying their behaviour on the grounds of that, retaliation. I have the right to do it. It's my entitlement. And what's more, I should do it. So they do it. And how many people are suffering and have suffered because of that? A belief that affects behaviour. But what about that one? Love your enemies. That means putting the agenda of your enemies first. Now that's tough. Praying for those who persecute you. And when Jesus spoke these words, persecution was physical, violent, and real in the Roman Empire. Today, many followers of Jesus are being persecuted mercilessly in various countries of the world, mainly communist and Islamic. And I am so proud of them when they love their enemies and pray for those that persecute them. They can only do that by the grace of God. But they're fulfilling the command of Jesus. That's part of his belief system. It affects your behaviour. You don't retaliate. You don't seek the way of violence. You don't seek the way of cruelty and ruling over other people. You seek their good. Beliefs lead to behaviour, and beliefs are in the mind. Back to what Paul was saying. Looks complicated. The words may be complicated, the ideas are very simple. Let me just unfold this a bit. In Hinduism, there's a tendency to see good and evil existing within God or gods, two sides of a divine nature. Now that means that when we do evil and make a mistake, we can blame God, because after all, evil exists in him. That's not what the writer to Genesis says. God is good, and all he created was good. You see, we cannot pass the buck to God. We must take responsibility for the evil we do. Look at dualism. The picture of two more or less equal and opposite forces battling it out in the spiritual universe. Now that's a Zoroastrian belief, but it's come into some Christianity. Genesis does not suggest, the Bible does not suggest that Satan and God are some kind of equals. You see, this allows us, that belief system of dualism allows us, when we do something wrong, to say, oh, it's not my fault, it was Satan's fault. You can't pass the buck to Satan. We hold responsibility. You can't pass the buck to God, you can't pass the buck to Satan, because the biblical picture pictures that. It pictures it in a balance between two things that appear to be opposites. How often truth is the combination of opposites. That's true in the physical world, it's true in the spiritual world. God is sovereign, but he doesn't overrule human responsibility. We are not pawns on a chessboard. We are responsible agents, but it doesn't overrule God's sovereignty. We take responsibility for what we do and don't do. We can't pass the buck and blame God or blame Satan. That's the point of what's being said here. There's no complete answer to the origin of evil. But what we do need to know is that we are responsible agents. And that's what the writer to Genesis is saying. The man and the woman took the decisions. We have the right to choose. And we choose. And we choose it wrong. And we have consequences for that. Curses? Oh, you may think curses is something medieval. That's all a curse is. A verbal statement that carries a power. So it happens. There were consequences for the actions on the snake. Consequences for the woman. Consequences for the man. And what we experience as they experienced. Insecurity. With each other, before God. They were now scared. They want to run away and hide from each other and from God. And they blame everybody. You can't pass the buck for your decisions. You can't blame God. You can't blame Satan. We carry the responsibility. That's what the Genesis writer is saying. Let's look at these consequences. I put them all up, but I want just to focus on little bits here and there. The snake. Look at the biggest box there on the right-hand side. The snake is presented as an anti-God person here. And in the New Testament and Revelation, we can see that the snake is to be identified with Satan, the anti-God personified evil. And there's a battle between this personified evil and the human race. That's what the Genesis writer is revealing to us. How true to life that actually is. A battle that we can't win, but Jesus won. But as I said before, that's another story. What about the woman? The greatest achievement, marred by pain. Desire for a husband ruled by husband is difficult to understand exactly what the writer is saying here. It could be interpreted two ways, both of which are probably true. Love and cherish, our picture of marriage, becomes desire, and the woman ends up being dominated by the man. Or it could be that the woman is seeking to dominate the man, but ends up dominated by the man. Now, in a sense, both are true. How often the relationships within marriage go astray. What about the man? In those days, the man's work was agricultural, producing the crops to feed himself and his family. This is going to be an endless round of battle to subdue the environment and get the food. And then the famous phrase, from dust you came, to dust you return, applying to man and woman. Physical death becomes the end, because they've lost their guaranteed inheritance of immortality. The door to paradise was clanged shut and locked. There's no way back. We humans can't, no matter how hard we try, get our way back to that immortality. It can only be given back to us by God's grace. And that's where Jesus comes in the New Testament. There's the consequences in practical terms. We have here an explanation of the world as it is. God's ideal creation of chapter 2, spoiled by human rebellion. And the human rebellion basically was that we took authority, which is God's alone. We thought we were clever enough to replace God, and we challenged what he was saying. And that involved consequences. Consequences that are dire. And the author paints these vividly. There's a barrier. Oh, it still exists. Security is forfeit. Our destiny for immortality, the guarantee, has gone. Relationships break down all over the place. A power struggle between the genders. A perpetual battle between humans and evil. And the goals of the evil one will not be ultimately fulfilled. That's the one little chink of light. Childbearing laced with pain. Providing food by blood, sweat and tears. What a terrible picture. But it's a picture that's reality. God's wonderful world. We made a mess of it. And we carry the consequences. By God's grace, he enables us to cope. By God's grace, he has pointed out better ways. But in Genesis 3, the author is trying to explain and interpret. And it's a picture of a disintegration of wholeness and consequences, which in our heart of hearts, we know and recognize are true. A remarkable story. Humanity's destiny, to tend and bring order to God's world. The model in the life of Jesus. Our failure, we thought we were good enough to do it ourselves. We declared independence and decided we could make the decisions on our own. We didn't need God. And there are consequences. Consequences that affect us at the personal level, at the spiritual level, at the physical level. They affect all of life. The consequences are there. Let's just move it up. Here's some examples. The mutual estrangement that occurs at the personal level. The brutalization of sexual love. The sex industries today. The use of rape as a weapon of war. Occurring widely in the Middle East, Pakistan, and in many other countries. We're in flight from God. We're scared of him. We think we can hide from him. And there's this endless battle with an evil within us. Then there's the battle with nature to manage our world, which only stops at death. What a picture of consequences for human rebellion. It's hopeless without God's grace. Only when He intervenes could we ever survive. And thank God, and I say that reverently, He does intervene, and He has intervened. In the next presentation, I'm going to pull in and try and summarise evidence from outside Genesis which relates to these chapters, particularly from the world of science. And I'm going to suggest the kind of controversies that have surrounded Genesis are of human generation. They're not real.